Our fellow teacher, Kyle Benson, is back with us today to talk about 5 ways attachment injuries in childhood impact adult intimate relationships. Welcome back to AVAIYA, Kyle.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to see you again. I'm excited to talk about this conversation of childhood trauma as it relates to attachment and attachment theory. So why don't we start there? What is attachment theory for people who don't know, and how do attachment injuries impact us as adults?
Yeah, so really attachment theory is, it's a theory that was developed over many, many years of how the relational dynamics we grow up with impact us as adults, right? So the love of care we get, how responsive our caregivers are towards us, how they treat us, start to impact kind of our sense of self. And they start to, and our brains in ways adapt to create a sense of safety in different relationships. And essentially, our attachment system is designed to maximize closeness for safety, and sometimes in ways that aren't exactly healthy. Because sometimes some of us grow up in really unhealthy family dynamics. And so we learn to protect ourselves or not ask for what we need, and be really focused on our parents' needs, right? Because that keeps us safe, but still keeps a relationship. And so these ways we adapt in our childhood that protect us and might keep us as safe as they can at that time, we kind of carry those into our adulthood. And those same strategies, while they worked earlier on, often become a place of protection that really blocks connection from becoming secure in the current bond that we're in. And so, in essence, there's really kind of 4 attachment kind of strategies or types that we really focus on. There's the secure type, which just brief kind of overview is someone who can ask for what they need, seeks comfort, is able to regulate their emotions, and has a sense that I can be totally myself and be connected to you. Whereas someone who is anxious grew up in an environment where their caregivers were not as responsive or were unpredictably responsive. And so they get really anxious. And so they adapted in being hyper aware of what the other person is doing. And one of those ways that they also adapt is they take this sense of self, they start to see themselves as a burden, as too much. And that causes them to often kind of in adult relationships be hyper focused on how do I improve this relationship? Do I need to hide my needs so I can stay in this relationship? So it leads to stuff like that. And we can go through some of the other types a little later. But in essence, the ways we adapt in our earlier childhood and through other intimate or close relationships shape kind of how our adult relationships function. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And what you're calling, right? I know there's different terms for attachment theory, right? Like strategies, styles, like or the couple that you just described, adaptions. Is that how you're like languaging it? Is that how?
Yeah, it's in a way our brain adapts from whatever environment it grows up in, and that adaptation, if it was effective then for whatever was happening, but then it's no longer effective. And unfortunately, because that's how we felt protected and safe, we often redo that same thing, even in a different context, even a different relationship, right? That's where I'm working with a couple today, partners being really comforting and loving, and other partners just close off and like, this is really uncomfortable for me to receive. This was not something I got. And they're frozen. Their body's not able to go, oh, comfort, love. Oh, it feels so good. Instead, they're guarded because it's really hard. It's really scary because that wasn't what they grew up with.
Right. And I'm curious, like in your work, because I know that you work with a lot of couples and helping them through their relationship challenges. Do you see like certain types of childhood trauma then reflect different kinds of attachment adaptions or strategies? Like, do you see one style versus the other show up more when you deal with people who've had childhood trauma?
Yeah. So, it depends on kind of what type of trauma you want to kind of label and look at. If you're looking at more abusive type of relationships, you're going to look at a lot more what we call disorganized attachment, whereas that they'll kind of like, I want to be close to you, but then I want to be far away from you. It's this sense of they're kind of give these mixed signals of how to be close and connected because closeness was never safe. right? They might have got close to their parent or their caregiver who was loving for a little bit and then was abusive, right? And so they have kind of these protection mechanisms that really kind of, in the best way they know how, are reading how safe things are based on what they think is going on in reality, because that's what they learned when they were growing up. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was just curious of, right, what you see showing up more often than not with it. So that was right. That's like physical abuse. Do you see different things with like sexual abuse, or just, let's say, emotional abuse or neglect, those kinds of things?
Yeah. So with emotional neglect, a lot more kind of just a lack of awareness of even their own feelings, right? If you don't really have someone who's attuning to you, you don't have someone who you grew up with kind of going, hey, what are you feeling? How are you doing? What are you enjoying in life? What are you struggling with? If you don't have that, and you don't have someone who's helping you regulate your feelings, you start to learn that they're not, that you might get the message that they're not important. And so you essentially kind of cut off from your feelings and become really logical. Right. And this is often something that I might see in men too, right? Society, be in your head, don't be all mushy gushy, all these other messages, toughen up, right? That's kind of a more systemic level of like the impact and how we show up in the world. And so if you have parents who are neglecting you emotionally, what I often see is we really start to have some pretty big messages about ourselves. I wasn't worth connecting with. Something must be wrong with me. Right. And we often take that in, and then we go into these adult relationships and we're sitting there wanting to be close, wanting to have this secure connection. And at the same time, terrified that they're going to see that we're too much, that something's wrong with us, that what happened in our childhood, the message we got there, is going to happen again in our adult relationship too.
Yeah, like what you said, right, about like being too much, or like the thing that comes to me a lot, probably because of my own childhood, right, is like this essence of inconvenience. And I think that is that's a big one. I always think of that. I'm like, oh, that's a painful one to have grown up with, because then absolutely we're going to, yes, project that onto partners and be like, oh, I must be an inconvenience to you. I'm not, even if you're not, right. But we might believe that just based on, what we grew up with. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that is one of the ways that kind of these injuries or these relational pain points end up kind of impacting our sense of self. And then we carry that into our adult relationships. We become very sensitive to anything that could connect to that. And so we'll have protection where we'll kind of preoccupy ourselves with something, right? Like me, like I had this big fear, right? I had to be really perform really well as a kid, and in sports, whatever I did. And that's where I got affection, that's where I got praise. So I got this message that love means performing well, it means doing well, being seen as excelling in other people's eyes. And so I worked really hard. And then when I got into romantic relationships, I would buy flowers, I would do extravagant dates, I'd do all this work to try to keep a relationship. And yet all that work ended up causing my partners to feel smothered. Right. And like I would focus solely on them at the cost of my own hobbies, my own interest, because it was like, this is the thing that I have to be this amazing partner to even to keep this person. Right? That was my injury that I had to really kind of work through.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me of our last conversation about codependency. And I too have experienced that similar thing of, right, really just like in my experience, just totally giving up all hobbies, passions, whatever was my personality, for the partner, even though they didn't want me to. It wasn't like there was none of that dynamic. It was all just, oh, I need to do, this is what I do. I give up all these things to make sure the partnership is, first and foremost, and what have you.
Right. And that is, again, that there's injuries there that have us adapt to believe that's how the relationships work. And we don't learn the secure message, which is I can be connected to you and be my whole self.